On the afternoon of October 26, 1881, in a dusty mining town in Arizona Territory, 6 men fired their weapons in a vacant lot for approximately 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay wounded or dying. That 30-second exchange has since been stretched in American popular memory into an hour-long showdown of quick-drawing heroes and cackling villains, immortalized in dozens of films, and a mythology that has almost nothing to do with what actually happened, or why. The real story of the gunfight near the OK Corral is not a story of good guys and bad guys squaring off at high noon. It's a story of a boomtown built on silver, a bitter political rivalry between 2 law enforcement factions, a feud over stolen livestock and unpaid debts, and a month-long courtroom hearing that produced sworn testimony directly contradicting the version of events most Americans think they know. This is what the actual 1881 record tells us, and where it diverges sharply from the legend. To understand why 4 men ended up in a gunfight on Fremont Street, you first have to understand the town itself. Tombstone, Arizona, did not exist as any kind of settlement before 1877, when a prospector named Ed Schieffelin discovered silver deposits in the surrounding hills. Within just a few years, that discovery had transformed an empty stretch of desert into one of the wealthiest boomtowns in the American Southwest. A town of banks, opera houses, and multiple daily newspapers, built almost entirely on the fortunes pulled out of nearby silver mines. Wealth of that scale and speed inevitably attracts competition, and Tombstone by 1881 stood sharply divided along economic and political lines. On one side stood the mining interests, merchants, and largely Republican town establishment, a faction that included the Earp brothers, who had arrived in Tombstone hoping to invest in local mining claims and business ventures, alongside Wyatt Earp's occasional work as a lawman. On the other side stood a loose, informal network of ranchers, cattle rustlers, and stagecoach robbers operating throughout Cochise County, broadly known as the Cowboys, a faction with considerable political sway of its own, including ties to the county's Democratic sheriff, Johnny Bean. This wasn't simply a conflict between lawmen and outlaws in any clean sense. It was a rivalry over political control of a fantastically wealthy county, one where the office of sheriff carried the lucrative right to collect county taxes, and where control of law enforcement had direct financial consequences for whoever held it. Wyatt Earp himself had sought the sheriff's position that ultimately went to Johnny Bean, and historical accounts describe a falling out between the 2 men that extended well beyond politics, complicated further by both men's romantic involvement with the same woman, Josephine Marcus. Layer onto this a bitter personal and business rivalry between the Earps and members of the Clanton and McClory families, stemming from stolen army mules, unpaid gambling debts, and accusations of stagecoach robbery, and you have the actual, considerably less cinematic foundation of the conflict that exploded into violence that October afternoon. The most direct spark came just weeks before the shooting. Sworn testimony from Wyatt Earp himself, given under oath during the subsequent hearing, describes a specific chain of events that most film adaptations either simplify or omit entirely. Earp testified that he had attempted to use his knowledge of accused stagecoach robbers, Bill Leonard, Harry Head, and Jim Crane, to secure a reward, hoping the resulting publicity might help him win the county sheriff's race against Bean. Earp stated under oath that he approached Ike Clanton with a proposition. If Clanton would help him locate the wanted men so Earp could claim the reward, Earp would ensure Clanton received a share of the money without anyone knowing Clanton had been involved. According to Earp's testimony, Clanton agreed, in part because Clanton and one of the wanted men were in a dispute over a shared ranch claim, and removing that man would resolve the dispute in Clanton's favor. When men took the lives of those wanted suspects before the reward could be collected, and rumors spread that Clanton had betrayed his own associates to the Earps, the resulting suspicion and anger according to Earp's own sworn account, poisoned the relationship between the two families for the following months and fed directly into the tension that exploded on October 26th. By the morning of the 26th, that tension had reached a breaking point. Ike Clanton had reportedly been making threats against the Earps and Doc Holliday for much of the night before, fueled by alcohol and by his suspicion of betrayal. City Marshal Virgil Earp, Wyatt's older brother, confronted and pistol-whipped Clanton that morning after Clanton continued making threats in public, disarming him and having him fined for carrying a weapon within town limits, a clear violation of Tombstone's firearms ordinance. Later that same day, Wyatt Earp had a separate, tense confrontation with Tom McClory on 4th Street. Witnesses would later testify to seeing members of the Clanton and McClory families gathering weapons and ammunition at a local gunsmith shop that afternoon, then making their way toward a vacant lot behind Fly's boarding house, near, though not precisely inside, the OK Corral itself, a detail worth noting since the Corral's actual entrance faced the opposite street from where most of the shooting ultimately took place. City officials, alarmed by reports of an armed and hostile group gathering downtown, made the decision to intervene. Virgil Earp deputized his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and the 4 men, including Doc Holliday, approached the group in the vacant lot with the stated intention of disarming them under the town's weapons ordinance. What happened in the following 30 seconds remains, even in the sworn testimony collected immediately afterward, genuinely disputed on several key points, which is precisely why the subsequent legal proceeding matters so much to any honest account of this event. We shed light on history using the actual record, not just the legend, and that kind of research takes real time and care. If that approach is something you value, subscribing genuinely helps us keep doing it. 4 days after the shooting, Ike Clanton, who had fled the gunfight without firing a shot, exercised his legal right under territorial law to file capital charges against Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, along with Doc Holliday. Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer convened a preliminary hearing on October 31, 1881, to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to send the 4 men to trial, and this hearing, stretching across nearly a month of testimony, produced the actual sworn record historians rely on today, a record considerably messier and more contradictory than any single Hollywood script has ever managed to capture. Wyatt Earp's own sworn statement, delivered under a specific Arizona territorial statute that allowed defendants to make an uncross-examined statement rather than submit to direct questioning, described the confrontation as one where the Earps approached the group intending only to disarm them, and where Billy Clanton and Frank McClory made hostile moves toward their weapons first, forcing the lawmen to fire in self-defense. Earp testified that Tom McClory, though not clearly seen holding a weapon during the fight itself, had access to a rifle in a nearby saddle scabbard, and that he considered all 4 men part of an armed and hostile party regardless of who drew first. Ike Clanton's testimony, by sharp contrast, described a fundamentally different sequence of events. Under direct questioning, Clanton testified that Doc Holliday and the Earps had opened fire on men whose hands were raised, men who, in his account, were attempting to surrender rather than fight. Clanton testified that he personally grabbed Wyatt Earp during the initial exchange, believing Earp was attempting to take his life, despite Clanton being unarmed at that point, and that he only broke free and fled once he realized the shooting had begun in earnest, running through a nearby boarding house and out into the open street beyond, deliberately avoiding, according to his own description of his escape route, even the OK Corral itself. These 2 accounts cannot both be fully accurate, and Judge Spicer's task, over the following month, was to weigh sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, including bystanders with no direct stake in either family's rivalry, against these 2 starkly conflicting narratives from the event's most interested parties. Other witnesses offered testimony that complicated both sides. Some corroborated elements of the Earps' account, describing what appeared to be hostile movements toward weapons from the Clanton and McClory side before the first shots were fired. Others supported aspects of Clanton's version, raising genuine questions about exactly when and by whom the first shot was actually fired, a detail that, even today, remains a matter of historical dispute rather than settled fact. On November 30th, 1881, after a month of testimony, Judge Spicer issued his ruling. He found insufficient evidence to send Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, along with Doc Holliday, to trial, concluding that the available evidence supported a reasonable claim of self-defense, undertaken by lawmen acting, however imperfectly, within an official capacity to disarm a hostile and armed group. It's worth being precise here about exactly what that ruling did and did not establish. Spicer's decision was not a verdict of innocence delivered by a trial jury. It was a preliminary hearing's determination that the evidence did not rise to the level required to proceed to a full trial, a legal distinction with real consequences for how confidently we can characterize the event's ultimate truth. Spicer's own written opinion acknowledged that Virgil Earp had shown poor judgment in deputizing his brothers and Holliday rather than seeking additional sworn officers, even as he concluded that judgment error did not, by itself, constitute grounds for a criminal charge. The public reaction to Spicer's ruling reflected precisely the political divide that had shaped the underlying conflict in the first place. Tombstone's Republican-leaning newspaper, The Epitaph, generally supported the Earps and characterized the ruling as a vindication of lawful conduct against a genuinely dangerous criminal element. The town's rival paper, The Nugget, aligned more closely with Democratic and cowboy sympathies, described the same shooting in far starker terms, and cowboy sympathizers throughout the county continued to view the outcome as a miscarriage of justice, favoring a faction with its own history of violence and self-interest. That political and personal conflict did not end with Spicer's ruling, and the aftermath deserves attention precisely because it complicates any simple narrative of the gunfight as a clean, isolated moment of justice served. Roughly 2 months after the hearing concluded, in December of 1881, assailants ambushed Virgil Earp on a Tombstone street and severely wounded him with shotgun fire, an attack strongly suspected, though never conclusively proven in court, to have been carried out by cowboy associates seeking revenge. Then, in March of 1882, an unknown shooter assassinated Morgan Earp while he was playing billiards in a Tombstone saloon, shooting him through a window in an attack that effectively ended any pretense of legal resolution to the underlying feud. Wyatt Earp, appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal in the aftermath, subsequently led a small posse that took the lives of several men he believed responsible for his brother's shootings, a campaign of retaliatory violence historians now generally refer to as the Earp Vendetta Ride, one that operated well outside any courtroom and produced no further legal proceedings of the kind that had followed the original gunfight. This is where the Hollywood myth diverges most sharply from the documented history, and where an honest account has to sit with genuine ambiguity rather than a satisfying resolution. Popular films have often portrayed the OK Corral gunfight as a triumphant final showdown, a clean and decisive victory of law over lawlessness. The actual historical record describes something considerably messier, a shooting whose precise details remain genuinely disputed, even in the sworn testimony taken just days afterward, followed by a legal proceeding that determined insufficient evidence for a criminal trial rather than delivering any conclusive verdict on guilt or innocence, followed in turn by a cycle of retaliatory violence that continued for months and that operated largely outside the legal system the original hearing had been designed to uphold. It was, in the truest sense, less a clean resolution than the bloody middle chapter of a much longer, considerably more complicated feud, rooted in mining wealth, political ambition, and personal grievance, rather than any simple contest between heroism and villainy. What the 1881 record actually supports is a far more human and more troubling picture than the legend allows. Men on both sides of this conflict had genuine grievances, genuine fears, and genuine reasons to distrust one another. Shaped by a boomtown economy where enormous sums of money, contested political offices, and competing loyalties created exactly the kind of volatile conditions in which a 30-second confrontation could permanently alter the historical record of an entire era. Judge Spicer's ruling gave the Earps and Holliday their legal freedom. It did not, and could not, settle the deeper political and personal conflict that had produced the shooting in the first place, a conflict that continued to claim lives on Tombstone streets for months after the smoke in that vacant lot had cleared. If a more grounded, evidence-based look at the Old West is something you'd like more of, share this video with a fellow history enthusiast. The real story, as it so often turns out, is more complicated and more interesting than the legend we've all grown up with.